Here's a question nobody wants to answer honestly. If someone in a lab coat told you to keep going, that it was fine, that you had to, that the experiment required it, how far would you go? Because a guy named Stanley Milgram already ran that test, and the results were not great for humanity. What you're about to hear is a list of psychology experiments that genuinely should not have happened. Not because they didn't work. Because most of them did. They produced real findings. Findings that are still in textbooks, still being cited, still shaping how we understand human beings. But the way they got those findings? Ethically, a little catastrophic. We're talking deception, coercion, a baby, some orphans, a bunch of monkeys, and at least one guy who checked himself into a psychiatric hospital on purpose and then couldn't get out. So, 5 experiments. Each one crossed a line. Each one changed psychology, and together they basically forced the field to grow a conscience. Let's get into it. Milgram Obedience Studies, 1961. Here's the setup. You're a regular person. You answer a newspaper ad. You come into a lab at Yale, so it's official, it's legitimate. There's a guy in a white coat, the whole thing. You're told you're going to help with a study on memory and learning. There's another participant, someone like you. They're going to be the learner. You're going to be the teacher. The learner gets strapped into a chair in another room. You sit in front of a machine with a row of switches. The switches go from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts, labeled, and I want you to really read these labels. Danger, severe shock. And then the last two, XXX, just XXX. Every time the learner gets a memory question wrong, you flip the next switch. Now here's what you don't know. The learner is an actor. There are no real shocks. Everything, the whole setup, is a test of you, of whether an authority figure in a lab with a polite script can get you to keep going. And Milgram's question was, how many people actually go all the way to 450 volts? His prediction? Most people figured maybe 1%, 2%, just the sociopaths. The actual number, 65%. 2 out of every 3 people, ordinary people, not monsters, went all the way to the maximum setting, while a man in another room screamed at them to stop. Now here's the part they usually skip in the textbooks. It's not that those people wanted to do it. The participants were sweating, trembling. One guy laughed nervously so hard the researcher made a note about it. These were people in visible psychological distress. But every time they tried to stop, the researcher just said, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue." And this is the line that haunts me, "You have no other choice. You must go on." And most of them went on. Milgram didn't find a monster inside people. He found something scarier. That responsibility can be outsourced. That if someone official is standing there telling you it's fine, your conscience goes looking for the exit. The experiment was brilliant. It was also obviously deeply unethical. Heavy deception. Psychological distress by design. Participants who left visibly shaken. It's one of the reasons we now have strict ethics review for research involving people. But it changed everything about how psychology understood obedience. Okay, so that was the adults. Let's talk about what happened to the babies. Little Albert, 1920. John Watson, one of the founders of behaviorism, had a theory. The theory was, emotions aren't mysterious, they're just conditioning. You can engineer them, build them into a person like software. And he wanted to prove it, so he found a 9-month-old baby. A healthy, curious, unafraid baby. The kid would reach for rats, rabbits, dogs, all of it, no problem. Watson and his assistant, Rosalie Rayner, began introducing a white rat to the baby. Cute, right? And then, every time the rat appeared, they made a very loud noise behind the baby's head. They did this enough times that eventually just showing the rat caused the baby to cry. They had successfully manufactured fear in an infant. But it got weirder. The fear spread. Not just to the rat, to a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, a Santa Claus mask. The baby had learned to fear anything white and fluffy. Watson called this stimulus generalization, which is a very calm scientific phrase for we gave a baby an anxiety disorder and then wrote a paper about it. And here's where it gets even murkier, because history has a weird twist on this one. Watson and Rayner never documented removing the fear they created. Little Albert just disappeared from the study. Modern historians have spent decades trying to figure out who he actually was, and the leading theory, based on archival research, suggests the child may have had neurological impairment that Watson didn't disclose, which means one of the most famous experiments in psychology might have been built on a misrepresented subject. We'll never know for sure, The baby grew up. The identity is still disputed. But the fear they built was real. Little Albert at least had a parent. The next group of kids didn't. The Monster Study, 1939, University of Iowa. This one even has a villain's name. Mary Tudor and Wendell Johnson took 22 children from an orphanage in Davenport, Iowa. Some of those children stuttered. Some didn't. The experiment divided them into groups. One group got positive feedback on their speech. The other group, including some of the fluent children, were told their speech was terrible, that they were developing a serious problem, that they needed to stop making mistakes. The explicit goal was to test whether you could cause stuttering through criticism and negative labeling. Now, to be precise, because the research brief flags this and it matters, the study did not definitively prove it could manufacture clinical stuttering. What it did prove was something arguably worse. The children who received the negative feedback became afraid of their own voices. They spoke less. They withdrew socially. Some showed signs of anxiety around speech that persisted after the experiment. The experiment tried to weaponize criticism itself, and the subjects were orphans. Children in an institution who had no real ability to say no. No parents to pull them out. No advocate. Just a researcher with a hypothesis and a group of kids who trusted adults to not hurt them on purpose. The study was buried for decades. The University of Iowa issued an official public apology in 2001, 62 years later. The surviving subjects received a legal settlement. One of them said she spent her entire childhood wondering why she was suddenly afraid to speak. She never knew there was a study. She never knew it was done to her on purpose. That's the part that's hard to move past. Okay, pause. Read done obedience, manufactured fear, and psychological harm to institutionalized children. You might be thinking, this is a lot. Yeah, it is. But here's the thing that makes all of these stick. They worked. The findings were real. The knowledge they produced is still used. That's the actual horror of it. It wasn't senseless. It was science that learned something true by doing something wrong. There's one more experiment that leans fully into that contradiction. And honestly, it starts with the most beautiful finding in the whole video. Harry Harlow, 1950s, University of Wisconsin. Okay, so before the darkness, Harlow's early work was actually kind of lovely. In the 1950s, the dominant scientific view of attachment, why babies bond with their mothers, was pretty transactional. The theory was basically, the mother provides food so the baby bonds with the food source. Love is a side effect of being fed. Harlow thought this was wrong. He set up an experiment with infant rhesus monkeys. Each monkey had access to 2 surrogate mothers. One was made of wire, but it had a bottle of milk attached. The other was covered in soft terry cloth, but had no food. The question was, which mother would the baby monkey bond with? According to the food is love theory, it should be the wire one. It was not the wire one. The monkeys spend most of their time clinging to the cloth mother. When they were scared, they ran to the cloth mother. When they were introduced to new environments, they came back to the cloth mother for security before exploring. Harlow had just demonstrated that comfort, warmth, and physical bonding are not side effects of nutrition. They are their own thing. They are a need. That's a genuinely beautiful scientific finding. It changed developmental psychology. It changed how hospitals thought about caring for infants. It changed the conversation about what children actually need. And then Harlow kept going. He built what he called the Pit of Despair, a chamber where young monkeys were placed in complete social isolation. No contact, no comfort, just nothing. The goal was to deliberately study what happened to attachment when you destroyed its foundations. What happened was severe psychological damage. Monkeys that couldn't function socially, couldn't form bonds, in some cases couldn't parent their own offspring. He was not discovering this as a side effect. He was creating it on purpose as the point of the design. That pivot, from discovering what love is to manufacturing what its absence does, is what makes Harlow one of psychology's most genuinely complicated figures. The first study gave us a breakthrough about attachment that still matters. The second gave us modern animal ethics oversight that still matters. Both things are true. That's what makes it uncomfortable. The Rosenhan Study, 1973. This one is different from the others because the people who got hurt weren't the participants. They were the institutions. David Rosenhan was a psychologist who had a question. If a sane person walked into a psychiatric hospital, reported that they were hearing voices, got admitted, could the staff figure out they were actually fine? He sent 8 pseudo-patients into 12 psychiatric hospitals. Each person reported a single symptom hearing a voice that said words like hollow, empty, thud. All 8 were admitted. Once inside, they behaved completely normally. No more claimed symptoms. Just normal people in a psychiatric ward acting like normal people. The average stay was 19 days. One person was held for 52 days. 0 pseudo-patients were identified as sane by staff. The patients, though, several of them flagged that the new arrivals seemed totally fine, which is a moment. Rosenhan's conclusion was striking. Once you're inside a psychiatric institution with a label, everything you do gets read through that label. Taking notes is writing behavior. Pacing is a symptom. Normal frustration is evidence of disorder. The study shook psychiatry. It pushed real conversations about diagnosis, labeling, and how institutions can start seeing the category instead of the person. But here's where this one gets complicated in a different way. Years after Rosenhan's death, a journalist named Susanna Callan went back to his archives for a book, and what she found raised questions about whether Rosenhan had been fully honest about the details, whether the symptoms reported were actually as mild as he described, whether parts of the popular story had been selectively presented. So we have a study that exposed the dangers of institutional labeling that may have also played a little fast and loose with its own narrative, which is either deeply ironic or the most on-brand thing that could have happened to this study. Here's what connects all of them. Every single one of these studies targeted the people least able to say no. A baby, children in an orphanage, psychiatric patients, captive animals, and regular people who were told by an authority figure they had no reason to distrust, that they didn't have a choice. And in every case, the knowledge they produced was real. That's the actual lesson, not science was evil. Science has always been capable of cruelty. The lesson is that the people running these studies convinced themselves the knowledge was worth it. And that's a human thing, not a scientist thing. That's the same calculation made by every system that ever decided some people were acceptable losses. These studies are remembered partly because of what they found, and they're remembered equally because of what happened after, because the backlash they created pushed the field to build actual ethical infrastructure, informed consent, herbs, rules on deception, animal welfare protections. Psychology learned what not to do by watching itself do it. That's the spine of this whole thing. It's not a story about monsters. It's a story about what happens when institutions decide that harm is acceptable if the answer seems important enough. And then, slowly, thankfully, decided it wasn't. Alright, that's 5 experiments that probably wouldn't get past a modern ethics review, but absolutely changed how we understand obedience, fear, attachment, identity, and how diagnosis can work against the people it's supposed to help. If there's one experiment from this list that you genuinely find the most disturbing, drop it in the comments. I already have a guess about which one it's going to be, but let's see. I'll see you in the next one.